Just a few words. Well, I don't need to present you. Maybe okay. We have some new people in the afternoon. Okay, we have Norah Niland.
Norah Niland. Yeah.
Norah Niland. Sorry, I always say Niland.
Just easier. Niland from Ireland.
Norah Niland from Ireland, and Antonio Donini. They are, as you know, they are both very well known in the field of humanitarian action with a lot of experience. They are both independent researchers, but also associated. Norah is associated to the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and Antonio to Tufts University. The reason why we took the chance, to ask them to present this initiative, and I have to say because I met Antonio last year during a meeting on humanitarian diplomacy in Bergen, and he mentioned to me the initiative, and someone that attracted my attention was that the question of, the need to create a civil society movement to stand up against impunity and crimes against inhumanity. But also I have to say, because he mentioned the question that Aleppo is today's Guernica, is what Guernica was before, today. And when I heard that, I said, wow, Guernica is like Aleppo. And I have to say I didn't think about it, and that you can make the comparison, but I think it's, for me was I would say an excuse to say, why don't you present this initiative in Bilbao? We are close to Guernica. Initially, we wanted to do it in Guernica. I think it would have had, a different maybe impact and visibility, but still, I think in the Basque Country, these questions, I think, move really the people, and I think it could be maybe, as we say here, in the rest of the state, this can, I think we hope to initiate maybe a movement that has echo in other parts of Spain. So I would like you to give you the floor to explain the initiative.
Okay, how do I do like this? Well, thank you very much, Christina, and thank you to Deusto University for allowing us to present this initiative. And as Christina just mentioned, I think it's a good symbolism of doing this and sort of framing some of the issues that we're going to talk about, also in the memory of what happened in Guernica. I'm going to talk about the background to this initiative, and then Norah will talk more about where we are now and where we plan to go. So, as Christina said, United Against Inhumanity is an emerging, potentially global movement of citizens and civil society organizations that people who are outraged by the present state of the world, and in particular by the inability or the unwillingness of the formal international system to address the causes and consequences of armed conflict. Our focus is deliberately on armed conflict. People ask us sometimes, well, why aren't you dealing with poverty? Why aren't you dealing with climate change, the big threats to civilization? Well, that's not our job. Our job, the way we've defined it, is to focus on armed conflict, the consequences of conflict for civilians who are caught in conflict, but also people who are trying to reach safety, fleeing from conflict. So this started because a group of seasoned humanitarians, to which some less seasoned younger people also joined over the past year or so, we started discussing, why is it that there is no channel that, compared to other movements in history, there were international moments where public opinion was mobilized, in Spain, the international brigades in the 1930s, the mobilization, for example, against the Vietnam War in the 1960s. I'm old enough to remember that. And, it was a kind of a mass movement. And we don't see this around Aleppo. We don't see this around Yemen. We know that a lot of people, and I'm sure you share this, are are outraged by the abomination of what is happening in these war zones, but somehow civil society is not engaged, or if it's engaged in ways that doesn't really help to advance the agenda, doesn't challenge or question the inability of the formal international system to address these issues. So our idea is to try to put citizens at the center, to put them at the center of efforts that will be, that we're not going to organize ourselves. The idea is to work with other groups who feel the same kind of indignation and try to generate a commonality of interest. Then it's up to groups in different settings to find the ways in which to mobilize and push on these agendas. So the overall objective is to do things that will increase the political and reputational damage to the perpetrators, whether they're states or non-state armed actors. And of course, we're not naive. We don't think that by having meetings like this one, we're going to influence Putin or MBS about what's happening in Syria or Yemen. MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. I know everybody knows MBS. He's
Not everybody uses the acronym.
No, I think everybody does now. So the idea is to test this hypothesis that by putting citizens at the center and by doing this in an international, potentially global way, we could achieve better results in trying to address the consequences of the inhumanity of wars. And of course, we're not the first ones who are talking about these issues, and we're not the, we're also very much aware of the obstacles in terms of trying to generate mobilization. People are perhaps over-informed in a sense. Nobody can claim that they don't know, especially in Europe, what is happening in Yemen or South Sudan or Syria or Afghanistan. If you want the information, it's there, but somehow people are not coming together to mobilize on these issues. So for us, we started discussing this about a bit more than a year ago, and there were three triggers that led us to discuss and then agree that maybe we should test this out. The first one was the failure of the major international conferences that took place 2015, 2016. The Red Cross conference, which is a conference that happens every 4 years, where the Red Cross movement sits and discusses how it could improve its performance. And one specific issue was on the agenda then, which was to find ways of injecting some kind of accountability or some kind of peer review of the behavior of the state parties to the Geneva Conventions in conflict situations. And the ICRC worked hard in preparing for this meeting. But then, countries said, well, this is complicated. It's, it's not mature yet. And China and Russia, of course, were not particularly in favor. And then the meeting ended with a decision that, we need consensus. Everybody has to agree to this. So it's too important. We can't just have a majority decision, so nothing was done. So lots of rhetoric, but no action. The next conference was the World Humanitarian Summit, which was in May 2016. I was there, and I had worked on a big study on looking at if the humanitarian system is fit for purpose, and we presented some of our results there. Lots of interest in reform of the system, and it was a pyramidal situation where you had the important ministerial meeting at the top floor, and then as you went down and in the basement, you had where the real discussion was going on with NGOs and groups, and the issues, more controversial issues were being discussed. But the bottom line, again, was that despite a lot of rhetoric, there was no conclusion. There were interesting discussions around localization, about simplifying the financing of humanitarian action, but no political progress was made. And the third one was the two summits on migration and refugees that were convened by the UN and President Obama in New York in September 2016, where again there was a lot of agonizing discussion on the importance of safeguarding the Geneva Convention, of finding ways for people to be able to migrate legally, et cetera, et cetera. But then they decided, oh, this is too complicated. Let's postpone the discussion 2 years from now. So you have an international system where issues are raised, but then the can is kicked down the road because you can't really make any progress, because the way in which the Security Council works, or I should say it doesn't work, the cross vetoes and the fact that everything is politicized, even I think we're seeing more instrumentalization and politicization of humanitarian action now than probably, after the end of the Cold War, many of us thought, oh, from now on things are going to be easier, but in practice it's not that easy. And then you had Aleppo, and one specific event was a letter that was written. Oh, let me read you the quote first. Aleppo is to Syria today what Guernica was to Spain during its civil war, a martyred city and the harbinger of more disasters to come. Equally, the UN risks becoming in the 21st century what the League of Nations became in the 20th century, i.e. irrelevant. So this was written, surprisingly, by the French permanent representative to the Security Council, François Delattre, and a French academic, and it was a letter to the Lancet. And it struck us that an ambassador, for whatever reason, would go on record sort of telling the world how irrelevant or how dysfunctional the international system was. So that got us thinking, and we were thinking initially, well, maybe let's focus on trying to reform the UN, but we soon understood that there were some interesting ideas on permanent members of the Security Council voluntarily withholding or restraining the use of the veto, and the French were behind that, and some 115 countries in the General Assembly sort of pledged support for this idea, but of course nothing happened at the Security Council. So the idea of the crisis of multilateralism, the failure of the UN, is in the background. We don't think we can address that particular issue, but we said, well, maybe let's try to focus on how collecting and assembling information in a credible way could be used not only by the usual suspects in the North, but by groups and civil society organizations all around the world. You're not allowed to say Global South anymore. That is supposed to be disparaging. So you can't say Global North anymore, because what does that mean? So all around the world is better. And so we started discussing how we could move forward on this agenda. We prepared a number of papers, and then we narrowed down the papers to a core document which is available on our website. So we prepared the document, but the first decision we took was, well, let's go and check if our views of people who have worked in humanitarian crises around the world, but yes, we still come from a certain group of people in the North, whether these ideas also resonate in the South. So we did a series of consultations. Obviously, we did some in Europe, but more importantly, we went to Beirut, we went to Nairobi, we went to Bangkok, Norah went to Myanmar, another colleague went to Maputo. Where else did we go? And also...
we also had a lot of bilateral.
Yeah, and so I think all in all, we interacted with 500 or 600 people in consultations where we presented our ideas and we listened to the reactions, which sometimes were interesting in the sense that the functioning of the humanitarian enterprise looks very different if you're sitting in Geneva or if you're sitting in Beirut or if you're sitting in Myanmar. Norah mentioned some of the problems with Myanmar this morning. And so basically what we after this round of consultations in June, I think it was, we had a a meeting of
Mini global meeting.
a mini global meeting of the sort of core group and we decided, okay, let's try to formalize this initiative. And that's when we started working on this call for action that you all have. And here I will pass on to Norah, but saying that basically the message that we want people to hear is one that it's unacceptable. We have to do something about the levels of inhumanity that we see in conflict today. And it's in conflict and people fleeing from conflict. So it's the atrocities in conflict and the asylum, the fact that the asylum regime and the migration regime in Europe, as we heard from Christina earlier today, is in deep crisis. So we have to do something. What we do is, it's a collaborative process, and Norah will give you some flavor of the where we are now and where we will hope to be going in the next few months, with your help.
Good afternoon again. So Antonio has given you a little bit of background, and I'm just going to add to that a couple of few minutes doing so. To explain what were some of the considerations, what did we decide at this strategic meeting in June in Geneva? And it was a roundtable meeting. Most of our meetings are by Skype. And based on the consultations we had in different places, it's very clear, as Antonio said, that there's lots of traditional or like long-standing as well as new initiatives. And the notion of United Against Inhumanity is going to echo and maybe some overlap with some of those. But the idea is not to duplicate what others are doing, including, for example, collecting data and information. Whatever is there already, if it's available, will be used by UII. So the idea is not to set up another Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch. The idea is really, at its core, is to try to find ways and means. When I say try, I need to underline that because we don't have any magic formula for this. And it will vary clearly from place to place how it's going to emerge. But the basic idea is to build on what's there, to connect, link arms with what's already there, and then to see how collectively, as a broader group, we can bring action to bear on particular issues of concern. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes now explaining what happened after June and where we are now before opening the floor to say, what are your suggestions on going forward? So after the June meeting, it was decided, and it was a long discussion and paperwork before that, whether it made sense to formalize UAI, because up till then, we called ourselves an initiative. But as of June, and it happened this week, we are now registered, and of course that takes a certain amount of legwork. And we're registered in France as a global NGO. And so we have adopted statutes and all the rest. And we also, it went up also last week or this week? Last week, a new website. And it's very clear that it's a work in progress. Because I should say that all of the work done up to now, it's done by volunteers. We don't have, obviously, we did raise a small amount of money that was used to travel to different places, but we've never had enough resources to get full-time staff or half-time staff. And we also, like for example, commissioned this logo, which we like if you don't like it, or indeed the title. We spent an awful lot of time on the title, and a lot of us are still not impressed with this title, but it was the best that we could come up with, having checked it out in different settings. And also, in principle, this week we have a bank account, because that kind of held back things a little bit. Whether or not we would go public with the call to action. Oh yeah, and then importantly, in terms of organizational structure, for this past year, we were 3 people, and then we were 5 people, and now we're 8 people. That constitutes the, I always get lost on this, IEC, International Executive Committee, as opposed to Electoral Commission. And basically, we 9 people, and we're from around the world, although the bulk of us are still from Europe, is what governs, and right now is also the people who do the actual work for the most part. In terms of the strategic plan that was adopted in June and is being revisited all the time by the International Executive Committee, that is the governance body, the core issues which already are in the call to action if you've had an opportunity to look at it, but that basically UAI will be an information generating body and an advocacy body. So it's going to be doing both. And of course, basically it's an advocacy body, but to be an advocate, you need evidence, you need data, you need to understand the situation, and we need to take, you know, humanitarian positions on different problems. So going forward, advocacy, as of this past year, we spent a lot of time consulting, and in the coming year, the idea is that we start biting in to see how we can be appropriate advocates or helpful advocates. And the first thing we've done on that, we've commissioned a short paper on criminalization in Europe of asylum seekers and those who are trying to help. And I'm not good at names, but the lady from Proactiva this morning, any of you were here this morning, talked about that. Yeah, and it's something that I think must be of concern to all of us, that is, yeah, that now when you try to be of help, you may end up in prison, including here in Europe. And then another idea we have, and we haven't really developed much yet, but it came out of a meeting in Edinburgh that we had end of September on how to go about, or should we go ahead and try to establish, develop independent humanitarian watch and or an index. And one of the colleagues at the meeting in Edinburgh, Peter Lundberg, who, when he was a Swedish government official, now he's back to being a Swedish government official, in 2012, he tried to generate an international humanitarian law watch, an IHL watch. And there was lots of effort and work that went into that. In the end, it didn't go forward. When Peter kindly, because he's now working in Jordan, came to help us out in Edinburgh, he started out by saying that it's easier to get away with a crime against humanity than it is to steal a car in downtown Bilbao, or in Edinburgh, he said it, than in downtown Edinburgh, of course. And, you know, and that should give us all pause for thought, that we have much, we meaning our different societies, our collective society, we are better able or more concerned about that kind of theft than we are about the slaughter of millions. So one idea in relation to that is that any of you have studied international humanitarian law in the room? Yeah, great. So most people are familiar with Common Article 3, which sets down the conditions to try to ensure, to minimize harm to civilians. And then there is Common Article 1 that is less well known, but maybe I shouldn't say that. Does anybody in the room know of Common Article 1?
Excuse me, I am the professor of international law. Everybody should know.
Oh, but that's why I wanted them to come forward. So Common Article 1, does anybody want to summarize the basic essence of that? Okay, well, it's you know, it's there in the 1949 conventions, which is called, that's why it's called common. And the essence of this article is just 3 lines, is that state parties, all of those who signed up to the 1949 conventions and the additional protocols, have a responsibility to respect humanitarian law, of course, and also a responsibility to ensure respect in all circumstances. And that, it's a long history since I started trying to investigate it, as to why it's not been very prominent, at least in my life it has not been very prominent, although I've worked in war zones for quite a while. I'm not a lawyer, but I know some of the basics of international law and refugee law, etc. So one idea we're currently contemplating within UAI is that we should use that as a hook in different settings to try to mobilize public attention. And as I always say, having done consultations in both, you know, what makes sense to do in Ireland is going to be different to what makes sense to do in Thailand. In Thailand, there's a war going on in the southern part of the country, and if the idea of UAI is to support local groups and to join efforts, we won't, not just working with local groups, but the idea is to pull together efforts or different networks to challenge inhumanity when it occurs in relation to warfare. And, you know, I've not lived in Ireland for a long time, but I don't know what would make sense there. But for example, the government as of about a few months ago, is trying to get onto the Security Council. You know how the Security Council works, different groupings vote every few years who's on the Security Council. So I was asking NGOs, well, like, what's your agenda around that? Or do you have an agenda? Or are you going to challenge the government to say, okay, if you get onto the Security Council, great, but what is it going to mean for people trapped in war zones? So stuff like that. So one idea in terms of advocacy, whether we use Common Article 1. We can discuss that in a moment. I said I'd take a few minutes, but I have a few notes here. So the Independent Humanitarian Watch, obviously it doesn't exist. It was an idea a year ago that we talked about that UAI would develop an Independent Humanitarian Watch. And it started out actually Humanitarian Law Watch until we heard about the Swedish initiative. And then after further reflection, we decided, UAI, how do I put this? It's not stuck on IHL, because of course IHL legitimizes killings, and we're against inhumanity. So it's an important standard that is there, that is not respected in many places, not at all. There's lots of breaches of it, and there's no mechanisms to hold state parties to account, which is what the conference at the end of 2015 was about. So the Independent Humanitarian Watch indeed is to look at inhumanity and breaches of the standards, humanitarian norms in different situations is the basic idea. And the meeting in Edinburgh was to help us to come to us, meaning UAI folk, to come to grips with that. And the meeting was a number of academics and people, for example, from Air Wars, the Dirty War Index. Colleagues in the United States have worked on Human Costs of War project. And it was bringing these people together to help us walk through some of the issues that we would have to address if UAI, which most probably it will at our next IEC meeting end of this month, decide to go forward. And the basic idea is that it's not us within UAI that would develop this, but rather that we would try to pull together a network of academics and others to help map that out and see what it would mean. Now, the bulk of the discussion in Edinburgh was actually about an index, which is, are there any statisticians in the room? I don't know, but it's a much, much more complicated task. And there's, when I started to look at it and read about it, there's books on indices, there's actually quite a number of indexes. And the nearest I could get to an index from a humanitarian perspective was the one that was here in Spain until a few years ago, and I haven't understood yet why it stopped, but it was the Humanitarian Response Index by DARA, Madrid, and that was an index, I'm scrunching it down, that was tracking good donorship. Were donors good donors?
That's why it was stopped.
Yeah, funny, but I think there was also other issues possibly. Yeah, so the idea is in moving forward on a humanitarian watch and or index is a huge amount of work. And the idea is that UAI would push or encourage or help pull together a group or a small network that would do the technical work on that. The other things we have done, you have it, call to action. I don't know if you've read it, because we're not going to obviously read it here. And that's, is both to help groups on the ground, but also to help a more international network to be identified within, operating on the same agenda. But it's also an outreach tool, the call to action. And outreach means we've had a number of meetings like this one here in Bilbao that started out in a discussion on Guernica. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but you're a next door neighbor. And then actually from here, Antonio and I joined two other colleagues in Paris this coming weekend there's a big event called the Paris Peace Forum that starts on Sunday, and there it's heads of state, where people like us don't get access. But on Monday and Tuesday, or maybe Jean-Baptiste is at the Sunday event, and then on Monday and Tuesday it's more open to NGOs and others, and we're participating in 2 days of different efforts to, again, always the focus is on challenging inhumanity and trying to develop a network. Antonio, again, I've just got three more things to say. Antonio already talked about the UN Security Council veto, and I think that's probably pretty clear. And it's not that this is a new idea, because governments, quite a number of governments, which is good, are behind an initiative that the P5, the permanent 5 members, do not use their veto in situations of crime against inhumanity. It's an important initiative, but hasn't worked out in a meaningful way as yet. The other thing on our strategic plan is fundraising. Up to now, we haven't really done fundraising because we thought that wasn't a good idea to do before we got formalized. We did get a small amount of resources from 4 or 5 French NGOs and foundations for the most part, as well as indeed Deusto University and others have worked with us in terms of developing and having consultations in different parts of the world. So this is where I'm going to finish. That then is, the last thing is that already there's small networks that are kind of there or coming together. One of them is in Britain, And when we were in Edinburgh, people in Scotland said, no, they wanted their own Scottish network, so that's good. In Ireland, it's kind of very vague. In France, there's been a meeting, but it hasn't really formalized as yet. So the idea is that and that's what's important for this meeting to understand is that, this room for understand, is that the idea is not that UAI goes out and develops networks elsewhere, but rather that groups and individuals elsewhere decide that they want to come together on these issues and then see what is appropriate in their context to do. So that's one idea of a network. And the other idea we assume is going to happen is that there are also thematic, that would be a geographic network, that there are also thematic networks. So for example, once we get our head further around the issue of criminalization in relation to asylum, we will see is there a value in linking up with existing networks and existing thinking and different groups trying to come to terms with that, as in trying to counter that. So networks is still very much a work in progress. And I'm going to finish there. And then the last note I say is that this discussion today is about getting your suggestions and your ideas. Do you think we are all
Dreamers.
not just dreamers? Dreamers sounds very positive. Naive and uninformed, or do you think there's value in trying to make this kind of initiative to work? Thank you.
I want to add two very small things. One is that we have a fundraising strategy that we are working on. In an initial phase, or in the foreseeable future, we're not going to ask any government for funds, certainly not for core funds of the NGO, because we feel that we have to be and be seen to be totally independent. One of the reasons that the Swedish initiative did not go anywhere was because they assumed that member states of the UN would, or at least the northern Nordic countries would be prepared, or ECHO would be prepared to give them some money. In the end, it was too hot to touch for these, and there's other initiatives like on protection. The Norwegian Refugee Council about a year ago,
No,
2 years ago, Jan Egeland, yeah, tried to have an initiative that was called Rebooting Protection. They also went to ECHO, and ECHO said, oh, yeah, well, if individual donors give you money, we'll give you something. And then they went to the donor and said, well, if ECHO gives you something, etc. So don't go there was the lesson. That was one. So what we're doing is also we're asking the people who sign up to give us €5, and we'll circulate the bank account soon. But that's not really where the money to set up an organization and start working is going to come from. If individual, the meeting we had in Edinburgh was, in a sense, public funds because it was the University of Edinburgh that financed it, and that's fine. It was money that was laundered through a university, so that we will contemplate, but not direct contributions of funding. The other one is that there are a number of initiatives already that are along the same wavelength, and one which is still going on in Palestine is run by a Swedish NGO called Diakonia, and they do for Palestine what we think an independent humanitarian watch could do for a series of conflicts. So they record violations of IHL, what happens at a checkpost, why did this ambulance with a pregnant woman blocked for 6 hours, and then they get the information and they go and challenge the authorities on both sides. Well, you're violating this and this law that you yourself have agreed to respect. So that, it doesn't change the behavior of the parties there necessarily, but it keeps them on notice. And so we think that in the same way you could potentially challenge bigger players, especially if this is seen as a movement that is not just in the north, but something that crosses cultures and types of participants. But basically, you could imagine having initiatives at the village level where you would go and see your mayor and saying, well, what are you doing to ensure that the government of which you're somehow part, or the system of governance to which you are part, what's our position on the war in Yemen? Are we indirectly supporting the war in Yemen? There's also, or in your place of worship, there's all sorts of possibilities where this kind of initiative could come to mobilize. So the basic mechanisms, the basic objectives, or what we aim to do, are on the call to action, is to produce reputable, credible, verifiable information, knowledge on particular crises, and then use this information to mobilize for change.